In a small snow-covered town where winter seemed to last forever, there lived a man named Edward Harper. He was 34 years old. Most people in town thought of Edward as cold, distant, maybe even cruel. But the truth was simpler than that. Edward wasn't cruel. He was broken. 7 years earlier, the woman he had planned to marry had walked out of his life without warning. No explanation. No goodbye worth remembering. Just gone. And from that day on, Edward stopped believing in love. He buried himself in work. He lived alone on the old farm his father had left behind. Every morning started before sunrise. Every evening ended in silence. And every day felt exactly the same as the one before. He told himself that was enough. Work. Food. Sleep. That was life. Nothing more. One afternoon, his late mother's old friend, Mrs. Callahan, stopped by the farm. She stood in his kitchen, looked around at the empty chairs, the cold stove, the quiet walls, and said softly, "Edward, a man can survive on bread alone. But he can't really live that way." He gave a dry little laugh. "Living's overrated." But that night, long after she had gone, her words stayed with him. For the first time in years, the silence in that house felt heavier than usual. The empty chair across the table. The untouched second cup. The sound of the wind outside. It all pressed down on him. A few weeks later, Edward made a decision he never thought he would make. Not because he believed in love. Not because he suddenly became hopeful. But because he was tired of eating dinner in silence. He wrote to a mail-order bride agency. His letter was blunt. Honest. Almost painfully so. "I cannot promise love. I can offer a home, respect, and safety. If there is a woman willing to live that kind of life, I will do my part." Weeks passed. Then one day, a letter came back. It was from a woman named Elena. She lived in a small village thousands of miles away. Her letter was short. Only one sentence really stayed with him. "I do not need a palace. I only want a place where I am not afraid." Edward read that line 3 times. Then 4. He couldn't explain why, but something about it settled into him. Months later, the day finally came. The train station was nearly buried in snow. Edward stood there with his hands in his coat pockets, watching the steam rise into the frozen air. He had already prepared himself. No expectations. No romance. No illusions. Just an arrangement. That was all. The train doors opened. Passengers stepped out one by one. And then he saw her. She wore a plain brown coat. A worn suitcase hung from one hand. She looked tired. Not the kind of tired that comes from travel. The kind that comes from carrying too much for too long. She walked toward him carefully. "Mr. Harper?" Her voice was soft. Edward nodded once. "Come on." That was it. No smile. No welcome. Just the sound of their boots crunching through snow. The ride home was quiet. At the house, he showed her around. "This is your room," he said. Then he added, almost like reading from a list he'd memorized. "I leave early. I come back late. I don't like unnecessary questions. There's food in the pantry. If you need anything practical, tell me." Elena looked around the room, then back at him. "Okay," she said quietly. And strangely enough, that was exactly what Edward wanted. A woman who wouldn't ask for much. A woman who wouldn't expect anything from him. But the next morning, something felt different. When Edward came downstairs, he stopped in the doorway. For the first time in years, the house felt warm. The stove was on. Light spilled across the kitchen. And breakfast sat on the table. Elena stood by the window. She turned when she heard him. "I thought maybe, you shouldn't leave for work hungry." Edward just stood there for a moment. He couldn't remember the last time anyone had cooked for him. But instead of thanking her, he said coldly, "You don't have to do that." Her face changed instantly. "I'm sorry." He left without another word. But all day long, the image stayed with him. The warm kitchen. The smell of coffee. Her voice. Why? He didn't know. Days turned into weeks. And little by little, the house began to change. Curtains appeared at the windows. Fresh bread cooled on the counter. A small jar of wildflowers sat near the sink. It was still the same old farmhouse. But somehow, it didn't feel empty anymore. Edward noticed something else too. He wasn't as angry. He wasn't as tired. He found himself coming home a little earlier. One night, he walked in and saw Elena sitting alone at the kitchen table. She was crying. He stopped. For a second, he almost turned around. But instead, he asked, "What happened?" She quickly wiped her face. "Nothing." "Don't lie." The words came out sharper than he meant. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then quietly, she spoke. "I was afraid." "Of what?" She looked down at her hands. "That maybe, you would be like the others." Edward frowned. "The others?" Her voice trembled. "My father drank. My mother died when I was young. After that, my uncle tried to marry me off to an old man for money." Edward felt something go cold inside him. "I ran away," she whispered. "And then your letter came." She swallowed hard. "I didn't come here for love. I came because I wanted one place in the world where no one could sell me. Or hurt me." The room fell silent. Edward had no answer. For the first time, he realized Elena hadn't arrived carrying just a suitcase. She had arrived carrying years of fear. That night, Edward didn't sleep much. And for the first time in years, he felt something crack inside the walls he had built around himself. After that, things slowly changed. Not all at once. Just little things. He sat down for breakfast. Sometimes he asked, "How was your day?" And every time he did, Elena looked surprised. Then she smiled. And something about that smile stayed with him. One afternoon, during a heavy snowstorm, Edward slipped while repairing part of the barn. He fell hard. A jagged piece of metal cut deep into his arm. By the time he got home, blood had soaked through his sleeve. Elena saw him and went pale. "Edward, sit down." She rushed for water, cloth, medicine. Her hands were shaking. "Does it hurt?" He looked at her then. Really looked at her. There was fear in her eyes. Not fear of him. Fear of losing him. And in that moment, something inside Edward gave way. He said quietly, "I'm all right." Then, without thinking, he reached out and took her hand. She froze. Neither of them spoke. But in that silence, everything changed. For a while, life felt almost gentle. Until the day Victor arrived. Elena saw him first. And all the color left her face. Victor was her uncle. He stood in the doorway like he owned the place. "She belongs with me," he said. "I came to take her back." Elena began to shake. "I'm not going." Victor laughed. "You don't get to choose." Edward stepped forward. "She's not going anywhere." Victor looked at him and smirked. "And who exactly are you?" Edward had never sounded more certain in his life. "I'm her husband." Victor threatened lawsuits. He threatened scandal. He threatened to ruin them both. But for the first time in years, Edward didn't back down. Not for himself. For her. He hired a lawyer. He gathered documents. He dug into Victor's past. And when the matter finally went before a judge, the truth came out. Victor had lied. He had tried to profit from her. And in the end, he lost. When it was over, Elena stood outside the courthouse with tears in her eyes. Edward looked at her and said softly, "You're free now." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she asked, "What if I want to stay?" Edward's heart pounded. "As part of the arrangement?" She slowly shook her head. "No." Her voice trembled. "As my choice." For a second, he couldn't breathe. This woman had walked into his life as a stranger. And without him realizing it, she had brought him back to life. He stepped closer. "I never promised you love." Elena said nothing. He swallowed. "But if you stay, this time, I won't just give you a house." His voice broke. "I'll give you my heart." Elena burst into tears. And for the first time, she wrapped her arms around him. Outside, snow still fell over the town. But inside that old farmhouse, for the first time in years, it felt like spring.